Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today as we stream on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel and on AM 950 Radio and on am950radio.com. Keep it locked right here on the voice of progressive Minnesota. And also go to the Santita Jackson and Friends page on Facebook. And meet me on Twitter at Santita J. We've got a lot to talk about today. What happened in Gaza? Uh, there is these humanitarian organizations are under assault, and one of the world's preeminent humanitarian organizations that was charged with getting food to Palestinians who are starving. The UN has said that this is a desperate situation for the Palestinian people, for millions of them. Well, the IDF bombed this caravan of volunteers and young workers in this organization 3 times to make sure that they killed them. And the person that they said that they were looking for was still at the warehouse. Really? We've got to talk about that. These munitions are, they're purchased by American taxpayers. Is that what you want your money to go toward? Let's talk about that. But let's talk about the underfunding of Black colleges, land grant colleges. But Black colleges really came out of slavery. I guess some people might call it a form of reparations, but whites would not let us into predominantly white institutions, so we had to start our own. And it was a good thing, and it is a good thing. But we just found out, thanks to the Biden administration, that in 16 states, Tennessee being the worst, but Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. These land grant institutions have been underfunded by more than 12 billion with a B dollars. It has cost them invaluable resources. They have not been able to have infrastructure, research and development, student support services, just so much. And yet they've been able to do so much. I mean, the overwhelming number of Black professionals come from these Black colleges. And yet they have been underfunded, just the land grant colleges alone, by $12.6 billion. We have got attorney Daryl Jones, Transformative Justice Coalition. He is with us today, and of course, we cannot wait to hear from him. We've got attorney Mark Fancher, National Conference of Black Lawyers, Sheila Garland from the Illinois Poor People's Campaign. But let's start with the President Emeritus of the Bennett College for Women. And indeed, she is an MIT-trained economist, the co-chair of the Push for Excellence program, one of the world's leading economists, one of our leading voices for peace and justice, and someone who could have made a whole lot of money doing many other things. And yet she has this zeal, like Dr. Glenda Glover at Tennessee State, who's been forced out. I want you to just give us his background, because when you went to Bennett College for Women, these are the kinds of odds that you faced. So talk to us. And having been coming out of Howard University, I was just sharing with you what Dr. Cheek endured 40 years ago, what Dr. Walter Leonard from Fisk University endured, Dr. Attorney Mark Fancher. Your father was an administrator at an historically Black college. And you talked about the tremendous price that he and other administrators paid trying to keep those colleges open, trying to keep them free. Dr. Malveaux, what is happening in Tennessee? Because you heard me list all of these states, 16 of them, and Tennessee being the worst. What happened at Tennessee State?
Well, Tennessee State is part of the state system. I used to always say in jest, I wouldn't work at a state university because you got to deal with 2 boards. You have your own board, and then you have the big board, the state board. The state board, they covet what Tennessee State has. Dr. Glover has done a tremendous job. She moved them up to a research 1, I think, in a couple of areas. That means the top level of research where you get more money from the National Science Foundation and folks like that. But in fact, she was so successful that one of the things that happened is that applications went up, so enrollment went up. Now, all of us in HBCU land want robust enrollment. So that you would think was a good thing. At the same time, University of Tennessee's enrollment went up. What did the University of Tennessee do? The state rented a hotel for the University of Tennessee to put their overflow students. I'm not clear whether they rented or bought it, but they created a whole overflow space for University of Tennessee. When Tennessee State asked for the same consideration, they said no, and instead sanctioned them for admitting too many students without having anywhere to put them. It was not unreasonable to think that Dr. Glover and her team would expect the same kind of treatment that the University of Tennessee got, where they asked for more money, a greater appropriation to house these. It turned out to be almost 1,000 extra students. Imagine that. That's like being a hog heaven as a college president. You got 1,000 more students, because many of us are enrollment driven. Instead, they called for an audit. The audit is going on as we speak. And the audit has found that the Tennessee State did nothing wrong. However, the legislature, which
but be successful.
Exactly. Exactly. But the legislature, which is a Republican supermajority, has both houses of the legislature are a Republican supermajority, has said the board was wrong. They've dissolved the board. So they've dissolved the board, and the governor has reconstituted it with his own appointees. There are no student representatives on the board. Before there were. Reverend Barber, Reverend Freddie Haynes of Rainbow Push, Roland Martin, and a bunch of other people were there last evening rallying, and the two young men who are student leaders were extremely impressive. And they just talked about the fact that no student voice now is being heard because they got rid of the student, and they haven't replaced the student representatives with another student. So essentially, the governor has taken over Tennessee State. That's the bottom line. The audit is still going on. So the audit have found nothing wrong. Usually it takes about a year to do a good audit. So why did they precipitously decide to act, in the early April, late? This really has been going on all academic year, but why did they decide to dissolve the board now? And the answer is just power grabbing on the part of Republicans. Understand, we have land grant colleges, first of all, because they're an agricultural focus. But secondly, we have our HBCUs because Plessy and other laws said that you had to treat folks equally. So rather than let Black people go to the University of Tennessee back in the day when it was designated land grant, they instead decided to create Tennessee State so that Black students have the opportunity to go to a land grant college. So that's pretty much how you end up with our land grant colleges in those 16 states that you mentioned. They did not want our students at the main land grant, so they created a parallel track. Consistently, these parallel tracks have been underfunded. Consistently, you can look at what be given per student. You can look any measure you find. Ours have been so underfunded that the sum of underfunding is in the billions. It's $12 billion. $12 billion. So that's where we are. And as a result of that, if a Black student who has no racial pride or racial leaning, if you looked at Tennessee State and the University of Tennessee, you would probably go to the University of Tennessee. They have better dorms, better cafeterias, better faculty, better paid faculty, not necessarily better faculty. And so often when given the choice, young people will say, I would like to go there. But the fact is that, as this young man said last evening, I'm not going to be comfortable there. They don't want me there. And young people know that. They know when they're not wanted. And so from that perspective, what we have is a situation, if you will, where these schools are basically under attack. And Tennessee State is the first, and it's not the first. And it won't be the last. We just had some things go about 5 years ago in Maryland, where the state had to pay millions. In Mississippi, there's an open attack now. They want to merge two colleges that are not close together to each other. So how are you going to merge them? And they claim they're going to be saving administrative costs. No, you're going to be eliminating the HBCU. And we can go, I'm frightened for Florida, where the governor you cannot use certain language. The word diversity, Georgia, Alabama. We can just go down the list. There is a war on Black people, and they're couching it in academic terms, like there's this whole anti-DEI movement. So what anti-DEI to me means anti-Black, because people keep throwing the word DEI around, like the young brother who's the mayor of Baltimore, where a big old ship had nothing to do with Black people, ran into a bridge. It's going to be trillions of dollars of damage. Some fool in the United States Congress said, "Oh, this is a DEI. This
mayor.
is what we have." Yeah, DEI mayor. Because a young brother, when he was told at 3 a.m. that this had happened, he rushed out of his house. He was tending to his 3-year-old daughter. Rushed out of his house with a sweatshirt on, an official City of Baltimore sweatshirt. It wasn't a hoodie, a sweatshirt on, and ran down. And they said, "Oh, he wasn't professionally dressed." Who is at 3 a.m.? But that word is thrown around. DEI is thrown around, basically to besmirch Black people. And then this climate is just so toxic. Yes, I mean, this has nothing to do with HBCUs, but well, maybe it does a little bit. But the young sister Angel Reese, who broke down yesterday after that basketball game, because
from LSU,
yes,
one of the top. Well, indeed, she and Caitlin. It's just they're almost like Magic and Larry Bird.
exactly.
Their competition is really blowing up in a good way. Women's sports, and particularly women's basketball. Hey, everybody watched that game last night, and the stadium
even then, I'm not a sports fan, but I had to see baby girl in action. But this idiot at the LA Times wrote a piece talking about Snow White versus the
Dirty Debutantes.
Yes, and if you Google Dirty Debutante, you know what you'll find? Pornography. So basically, these young women have been sexualized. I didn't even know what that was until I know what pornography is, let's be clear. But I did not know that allegation. It was like gross. It was just like, really, do you want milk and cookies or hot sauce? They made him change his editorial, but I think they should have put his behind on a couple weeks suspension, if not totally fired him, because it's racist and sexist.
Absolutely.
But that's where we are.
But let me stop you here, because Tennessee is, it's $12.6 billion over 16 states. That's a lot of money. But Tennessee State has been denied $2.1 billion with a B. My parents went to a land grant school. They met and married at North Carolina A&T State University, down the street from Bennett. And when I went to the campus, my mother got an honorary doctorate about 3 years ago. When I went to the campus, it was shocking. Just all of the money that has been poured into that school. NASA has a project there because, Ron McNair went there. It is a great school, and it is also the biggest Black school in the country. I think 2 years ago, they had 14,000 students. Yeah. It continues to grow and grow and grow. And one of my fears for Howard is that they're going to turn these Black schools that have been so successful into PWIs. But that's another subject.
That's another conversation. But anything get.
But hold on. But let me ask you, what could you do? You've been in the hot seat. You've been the president of a Black school. When you are underfunded by $2.1 billion, what does that look like? What is missing?
Girl, please. I can tell you stories. One of I will never forget. It was my first year as a president, and in one of the dorms, the boiler burst. The boiler was so old that we actually had to send to Europe to get the part for the boiler. I couldn't keep the girls in the cold dorm. One of my board members actually said, "Let me get some hotel rooms for them." So that was a blessing, and we were able to do that. But it was chaotic and expensive, and I felt so helpless at that moment. I sat on the step of the president's house with tears rolling down my face. I just felt like, and me, I don't cry. I'll fight. But I just sat there. I'm like, what can I do? Literally, what can I do? And the community of Greensboro was great in an interesting way. They will support our HBCUs, Bennett and A&T, but through a lens of patriarchy, number one. So they're more likely to support A&T than Bennett. We were just a girls' school. But number two, one of the offers I got, which I could not take, and it was quite funny, is a contractor who said he had an old boiler that he would let us borrow. Now, the cost of us retrofitting the old boiler to fit the system we had exceeded the cost of a new boiler, and it made no sense. So, I mean, as Black college presidents, we're constantly fighting for the survival of our colleges. I remember again in my first year, we had some young ladies who weren't going to be able to graduate because they had their balances. Roland was kind enough to let me go on the air, and we raised about 20 grand just from an on-air appeal to people. I think it was his radio. He had radio program then. But you're constantly fighting, but you're also constantly on a tightrope because you can't offend, especially if you're a state university, which is why I blessedly didn't have that challenge, but you can't offend the funders. The state legislature is the funder. You cannot offend the funders because if you do, they will retaliate. You know that Dr. King, the president of A&T back in 1950, I forget what year, I wasn't there. Basically, the president would not let Dr. King come to speak, even though the facilities at A&T were far superior in terms of how many people they could hold, in terms of capacity, far superior to Bennett's. Our biggest thing was our chapel, which on a good day, if people sat in each other's lap, might seat 2,500. A&T, of course, has the auditoriums. They've always had them because the Black community in Greensboro, a whole lot of them, like Reverend and Jackie, went to A&T. People loved A&T. But the president said, if I bring Dr. King here, I'm going to risk my appropriation.
I will lose my, and he would have at that time.
And that's why Dr. Willoughby Player, who was the first woman president of Bennett, said, let's do it here. Mm-hmm. And of course, again, it was crowded to the point of overflow. And people were in each other's laps. People were standing outside just to get a glimpse of Dr. King. So, the whole notion of your funders. I mean, I got a lot of trouble, unfortunately, because we had a couple of big Republicans. And of course, I was unfiltered, and it kind of didn't turn out right. I remember the board chair calling me and saying, "Mr. President, did you call Mitt Romney an idiot?" And I said, "I don't remember." He said, "That means you did." I said, "Oh yeah, that part." She said, "What are you prepared to do about it?" I said, "Well, what am I supposed to?" She said, "You need to call these two Republican board members and apologize." I said, "I can't apologize." She said, "Well, put it in context then." So I did. I said, I was on ABC News and we're talking about the election. And we thought we told you stay away from politics. I said, sometimes I can't help it. And I didn't have to pay a large consequence, but I did pay a consequence.
But but that was the challenge that I saw up close and personal at Howard with Dr. Cheek, Dr. James Cheek, who grew that university. We got a hospital, the top commercial radio station in the DMV, in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region was WHUR, a college station. The Quiet Storm format that everyone hears about, it was developed and perfected at WHUR. We got two radio stations, an on-campus radio station. We got a PBS television station. I mean, the Dunbarton Law Campus, one of the choicest pieces of real estate in the country. All of that and then some. And they kept on expanding and expanding. He got pushback from the campus, but people had no idea all that he was going through. And yes, did he have personal politics that were conservative? Yes, but he didn't curb yours. But these are the challenges that are facing Black colleges and Black college presidents. You know what? Let me pivot to you, Mark Fancher, because you have experience with this, because you are the child of Black colleges. And of course, your son is a mighty, mighty bison. Oh, yes. I had to say it. But you have seen, well, come on, I had to say it. Come on, that's my school. But you saw this, your father was a vice president and an administrator where?
At Tennessee State. And listening to Dr. Malveaux, really sort of brings back memories and really sort of reminds of the tragic irony of all of this. Because back in the 1970s, as she described, they had developed these parallel systems of higher education in the state of Tennessee. There was the University of Tennessee system, which was predominantly white, and they also had a system that was administered by a state board of regents. And Tennessee State was a board of regents school. The University of Tennessee had a branch campus that was located in Nashville, just a few miles away from the Tennessee State University campus. And the controversy then was that whether it was constitutional for the state to maintain these two separate institutions that were essentially racially segregated. And so the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that these two institutions had to merge. It was a foregone conclusion when that ruling came down that the University of Tennessee, Nashville would be the surviving institution, and that Tennessee State University would go the way of, it would become a part of history. But the president at the time was a man named Dr. Andrew Torrance, who essentially said, not on my watch. And when the Sixth Circuit ruled that it would make its decision based on the merits of the two institutions, he resolved that in every way he would give the Sixth Circuit no opportunity to say that Tennessee State was the inferior institution. And so, as I mentioned before the show, my father, along with several other people, were recruited into a group of vice presidents whose sole responsibility during that period was to ensure that that Tennessee State University had no flaws, that in every respect it was as perfect an institution as it could be. And it took a toll on these men, and it really used to frighten me to death, because I was probably about 11, 12, 13 years old, because I didn't know if my father was going to come home every night based on what was happening to some of his colleagues. But they worked. And finally, in or about 1977, the Sixth Circuit handed down its ruling. And to everybody's astonishment, they said that Tennessee State University was by far the superior institution, and it would survive. That the University of Tennessee, Nashville would be merged into Tennessee State University. And my father made a joke. He said, well, the judges on the Sixth Circuit must have been watching Roots or something. But I say all of that to say that for Tennessee State now to be the surviving institution, and for it has been the surviving institution, the sole institution in Nashville since that time, with a whole series of presidents and administrators who have been excellent, superb, Dr. Frederick Humphreys, and we could go on and on about all of the different people who've come through that university and have done amazing things with it. And for anyone to suggest that it should not be entitled to all of the funding that should be made available to the university that serves that area, it is just, I don't even know what the word is to say about something like that. I mean, basically what they're saying is, yeah, you should get it, but because you all are colored, that's not the way it's supposed to go.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that what's happening to TSU now should not be looked at in isolation from what has been happening to HBCUs in generally. And I process this as a recognition by the entire MAGA crowd and all of these other reactionaries that they recognize the potential of HBCUs and the fact that this is the breeding ground for Black genius. And that if you're at war against a people, you want to take out their intelligentsia, and you do it by whatever means are convenient and available to you. So you mentioned, I mean, it's so much, it has gotten to the point where I know that many of the students at HBCUs have almost gotten into the routine of evacuating their classrooms because of bomb threats that seem to come in every week.
All the time.
And so it's almost like when we were kids and we have fire drills and things. Oh, well, we got another one of these. Oh, well, we got another bomb threat. And there is an ongoing hostility toward Black excellence and a Black intelligentsia. And this, I think, is one more manifestation of the attacks that are headed that are directed at these institutions.
Sheila Garland, I saw you nodding vigorously in assent as you've been listening to Attorney Fancher and Dr. Malveaux. What is striking you?
Well, there's a lot here. First of all, thank you again, Santita, for having me on. It's an honor to be with Dr. Malveaux and Mark Fancher and Daryl Jones. I really appreciate this opportunity. Full disclosure, my father was an auto worker in Flint, Michigan. They came from Arkansas on the back of a migrant truck, picking vegetables to leave Arkansas, to leave the South. So when I grew up, there wasn't much discussion because we ended up in a pretty much all-white enclave outside of Flint in Davison. So I didn't really have the understanding of the historically Black universities, but that's all in the past. But there's a scholar who I knew here in Chicago, Dr. William Watkins. I don't know if you remember him, Bill Watkins. He wrote this incredible book called The White Architects of Black Education. And for me as a political person and also really interested in the history of the various uses of political maneuvers to reach certain ends in this country in particular, but of course exported through various colonial measures around the world. The political root of these attacks, I think, are really, to me, are reflective of a goal of implementing a tremendous amount of division and chaos, so that as a group, not only as African Americans, but as a class, because a lot of our young people, young Black working kids, who are able to, because there were a lot that left Flint and went to historically Black colleges and universities to get those premier educations that can't happen. But to me, there's this really overarching sort of what Mark was alluding to, of political intrigue to utilize aspects of fascism historically that have been used in the South to sow chaos and division. We also know that the South, the politics of the South, control this country, right? I mean, the politics of what did W.E. Du Bois say? The shadow of the plantation follows us wherever we go. Anything south of Canada is, is a plantation. So, without going into a whole lot of detail, for myself, I think I'm trying to really get a handle on where these political moves are coming from out of these states that are working so hard, because we know that these cabals exist among the very wealthy. You have what was that whole the Koch brothers council. You have all of these things who come up with quote unquote model legislation to figure out how to reach political ends. So my suspicion is that there's some of this kind of going on. I know Dr. Malveaux probably would know better, and some others may know better. But I suspect that some of these things are potentially at play. Like we see some of the impacts when you hear similar language being used across the country in some of these places. So my conclusion is that there is a concerted effort to try to achieve something. And I think that something is, one, to make sure that we're kept off track, that we're not able to fight the larger political fights that we have to fight in order to, really get at what's creating all of this chaos. That's number one. Number two, like I said on another program, when you have the head of the CFR saying that he doesn't know the solution, they don't know the solutions to deal with poverty, that means that the solutions have to come from us, that we have to figure out what has actually happened and understand our history so that we can wage that political battle for ourselves. But I also think that that they're going to have that whatever resistance grows up, because anytime you create oppression, you also create resistance. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of resistance that's going to grow up, especially from among young people, when you start talking about taking away something that has been historical in our society, in our communities. So that's kind of my initial take on it. I'm really happy to see that the campaign that Reverend Barber, not the campaign, that Reverend Barber was there, and that folks were there, really to highlight, just the travesty, the political travesty of this situation, and its rippling impact in our community, but not like Mark was saying, just across the board. And so as you destroy institutions and figuring out how you because if you go back and look at certain institutions and we see what they look like today, we have some idea about how to retool and refashion institutions to serve a different political agenda. And so, I'm just, those are kind of my thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of off the cuff of my head.
No. I mean, I don't, but I think, first of all, we all have skin in this game. I think of my father, and he was part of this group of Black people who desegregated the Big Ten. He went to the University of Illinois to play football. He had a horrible experience there, a spirit-breaking experience, something he never really discusses, but we've been able to piece it together. But he went and he sustained an injury, and he decided not to go back there. He decided to go to A&T because he said the energies at A&T, they're having a sit-in movement. I think I can fit in there. And he walked, and you can appreciate this, Dr. Malveaux, and you too, Attorney Fancher. He walked into Reverend Dr. Sam Proctor's office, who was the head of the university at the time, and talked his way into a full scholarship. And Dr. Proctor said, I always knew that this young man was a young man who needed a chance, that he was going to do big things. And all he needed was an opportunity. So, and he would tease him through the years. When my father was a little anxious about his first presidential debate, he called Dr. Proctor because he remained a mentor. He said, Jesse, you have wanted to be a big man all your life. Just go. This is where you wanted to be. Go on. But my point is, it was at that Black school that he was not seen as someone small. The Dr. Malveaux see who you really are, and they push you in that direction. And these people know. That's why the people at the Council on Foreign Relations, they know the answer to poverty. They just don't. They don't want to hear.
Well, Santita, I always tell people at an HBCU, we assume that you're brilliant until you show that you are not.
There you go.
At a PWI, they assume you're stupid until they show you're not. I mean,
and wait a minute, girl, and then they don't believe it.
No, 54 years later, because I was 16, I can still tell you what happened when I was accused of plagiarism from some white girl who was sitting behind me and had the same sentences in her paper. So the little white professor, she was a ABD at Harvard, accused me of cheating. And the dean agreed.
Wait a minute, this way? Looking over your shoulder. Is that crazy?
And the dean agreed. So my mama, who was crazier than me, wrote the man like a 12-page letter. How did my daughter become ignorant? She wasn't ignorant when you admitted her. She wasn't ignorant when you let her in school without I never graduated from high school. She said, so when did she become ignorant all of a sudden? And then, she took it made my letters look mild. I was like, dang, mommy, what, do you have anything to do? She said, I was mad. I was really mad. So the dean says to me, how do we solve this problem? I said, I know I can write. A lot of my stuff about myself, I don't know. I know I can write. I, by that time, had been published in the Black Scholar, et cetera, at 15. So I told the man, I said, put me in a small room, give me a topic, and I write about it. So he said, well, you write about whatever you want. I want to know that you can write. So he put me in a small room, no typewriter, had long hand. This was 1970. And I wrote about, he had a big old dog, so you know how I feel about that. I wrote about the inadequacies of men who had large dogs and small other things.
Nice. Thank you, Dr. Malveaux. So as you see, President Emeritus of Bennett College, for women.
Well,
Attorney,
the man told me, he said, I disagree with you, but yes,
you
ma'am,
right.
you said right.
I mean, but
Oh my
leadership
God,
is
I love it.
but leadership is bred in majority environments. And I think that they understand that. And that is why the breaking of our Black institutions is so important to the power structure. Let me go to you, Attorney Daryl Jones, and then you, Reverend Dr. Yuri. Attorney Jones, when you hear about these 16 states, $12.6 billion, $2 billion at Tennessee State University alone, 2.1, excuse me, 2.1. And the thing is, Dr. Glover said, I want my money. And they treated her like Aristide. That's why they chased her. They chased her out of that position. She did. The institution itself would have suffered had she stayed, Daryl. That is really the unspoken, horrifying reality that she was looking at.
Santita, the amazing thing is that they did all of this to Tennessee State University. They withheld all this money from that university, and it still existed and turned out incredible students.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if they had gotten all the money they were due, what they would have been able to, further things they would have been able to accomplish? I sit back and I look at it from my legislator's hat. Right? The concept there is supposed to be you want to produce out of your state the best workforce that you can.
Mm-hmm.
And the most educated workforce that you can. Tennessee is doing the exact opposite thing. Today, they're doing the exact opposite thing. It doesn't make sense. When I think of Tennessee, I think of Justin Jones, I think of Justin Pearson and what they did to them in that legislature. It's a state, Santita, where politically their legislators have drawn the line such that they're inoculated from any real challenge so they can control their power. So it doesn't, I guess, surprise me that they would figure that they can now take their power and take over this HBCU so that they can, who knows what their plan for it is, whether it's to shut it down or to make it less Black, whatever that plan is. It seems to me to be the complete opposite of what a good legislative body, what a strong state would want to have happen. Because the HBCUs in Maryland, they've had their challenges, and Reverend Yuri and definitely Dr. Malveaux will know about the curriculum challenges that the PWIs did with the HBCUs here in Maryland. Those challenges existed, but they overcame those challenges to the degree that they could, and they still continue to produce this great product. And I'm a product, right? I went to an HBCU, so I got that, that part of it. And I went to a PWI, so I got the mixture of it. But it just dumbfounds me that there's a legislator that would be crazy enough to shoot itself in the foot rather than put out the best workforce that it can, and using the students and the talents of Tennessee State University, which is the only public HBCU that's in that state of Tennessee. It's just dumbfounding to me, Santita.
It's unbelievable. Reverend Dr. Yuri.
Well, as I'm listening to the discussion and considering the issues, a couple of things come to mind. One, it's Tennessee. All you need to do is look at the history of litigation and Southern compacts back in the early 20th century, where Southern states actually had an agreement where Black students who wanted to attend state schools would actually be able to access funds to go to white schools in the North rather than go to state schools in the South. At the same time, you have the underfunding of HBCUs, which was part and parcel some of the legal underpinning of many of the higher ed cases that Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and Legal Defense Fund and Constance Baker Motley filed, because the doctrine of separate but equal was separate but never equal. And so we see it now in the calculation of what the economic harm has been. And I would argue that it's probably conservative, even in Maryland, where Morgan State University filed suit, some interested parties filed suit about program duplication, that when Black schools were creating high demand programs, white schools would come in and replicate them and make it difficult for them to compete. And so in the process, it led to further economic harm. The value of settling that case by legislation in Maryland just a few years ago, when Larry Hogan was governor, Larry Hogan said the value of what he thought the settlement ought be would be about $200 million. The legislation ended up being $577 million and forced his hand. Of course, after his hand was forced, he showed up to the bill signing, skinning and grinning, and wanting to take some credit for what had come from it. So part of it is we have to expect that there is not going to be any sense of a dignified response when you see the disruption of the board. I've chaired the board of a minority serving institution, not quite an HBCU because of the year in which it was founded here in Baltimore. But what we often find is this extreme criticism about how governance is done, how programs are administered, how enrollment is disrupted because of the economic realities of family destabilization and poverty. And then therefore you blame the system, the school, for creating these problems or not being able to respond to them, when in reality, it's a byproduct of the design. And so when we look at what is happening here, this is a rerun. It's a 2024 version of a movie that we've seen before. The question becomes, with a Supreme Court that has now become apologetic about anything tied to racial justice, the question is, what becomes the method by which we push back? One has to be clearly political. There has to be political engagement in terms of who gets elected down ballot, not just who's going to be running for the big chair to sit in the Oval Office. There has to be some accountability in terms of how do we elect the president? Because at the end of the day, who sits on the federal courts at the trial court level has everything to do with which cases may eventually get to the Supreme Court anyway. And so when we put it in a historical context, it's really more of the same. And it has its roots and antecedents in the prohibition going all the way back to slavery in North Carolina, where Madam President Emerita was at Bennett. There was a law on the books. The law said that you could not teach a Negro to read. What was interesting was not the prohibition. That wasn't unique. The penalty for violating that law was harsher for the student than it was for the teacher. That cultivating the desire to develop the genius of Black students is met with such ferocity until we have to recognize that this is not a new version, it's just the updated version of the old story. And the question that we have to wrestle with is, what are we going to do and when are we going to do it?
Todd, you know
Dr.
what's
Malvo?
interesting about that law? That law actually would call, if a white person, and it was, they didn't say Negro, they said to teach a slave to read is to excite dissatisfaction to the detriment of the general population. It goes on to outline the penalty, but a white person would be flogged up to 20 stripes if they chose to teach a slave to read. Now, they could teach you to count because they trusted you, us enough to hold their money, but they could not teach you to read. And as I said, when I read the law, I mean, it was part of my inaugural address. I remember it. And it's a chilling law in terms of flogging. You're going to flog white people. And then, of course, they flogged the white person up to 20 lashes, and the Black was up to 40. And from my reading, you could not live if you had 40 lashes. I mean, that was like a death sentence almost. Yeah. And the dollar fine for a white person approaches what will be $10,000 today. It's amazing. And there are 14 other states. North Carolina wasn't the only one. 14 other states that had the same kind of laws.
But you know, Dr. Malvo and panelists, look, you've heard of drapetomania, right? Mm-hmm. It's a mental illness when you want to be free of slavery. It is a term that was developed during turn back around during the slave period, drapetomania. Drapetomania. If you were a slave, so an enslaved person who wanted to be free, you were mentally ill, and that was the name of the illness, Mark Fancher. Drapetomania, drapetomania. So there, I mean, the roots of this system. There's a lot of sickness here. I want to get a minute from everybody. Well, maybe just under a minute because I want Dr. Malveaux to close us out. But Attorney Mark Fancher.
Yes, I suffer from chronic drapetomania and don't want a cure. And I think that that's the great fear that increasingly young Black students want that too. And they know that they're going to get it at an HBCU. And there are more and more conscious decisions being made, more informed decisions being made by Black high school students about where they want an education. We've had experience now in predominantly white institutions, and we know that they mean us no good most of the time, that the tensions and the pressures are there that are not found in HBCUs. And more people want to go there. And I think it becomes our collective responsibility to make sure that that our coming generations have that opportunity. And we've got to figure out a way to make sure that that's an expectation that's met.
Absolutely. Just under a minute. Sheila.
Yeah, I'm certainly pondering the larger historical and political aspects of what's happening in Tennessee and across the country. And the campaign is really talking about a third Reconstruction, that we're on the precipice of a huge economic and political breakdown. And we have to really talk about how do we begin to, politically take what is at the very top of society and guarantee that it moves to the bottom of society so that we have some control, not just control, but that we can create a society where we can all thrive and survive. And this is what the campaign, this is one of the reasons I'm attracted to the campaign, is because of that third Reconstruction resolution.
Absolutely. Attorney Darrell Jones, under a minute.
I'm suffering from that drapetomania too, along with my Fancher. And, it was my HBCU that freed my mind because I had gone to predominantly white institutions all the way up to my HBCU. And I can understand why Tennessee is so afraid of having a free-thinking Black person that would be well-educated. So, my encouragement would be for folks to get out there, be certain you're registered, be certain you vote, because we need elected representatives that will hold these folks accountable in Tennessee and across this country, Santita.
Indeed, because it's an elected legislature that's imposing this horrific circumstance on this university. Reverend Dr. Uri.
A gerrymandered legislature that is
At that.
imposing it on the university. And I'll quickly punt to Madam President. The other part that's interesting is that while the legislature is imposing its hostility on Tennessee State, we haven't really talked about how HBCUs have to maintain accreditation in the midst of such formidable resistance. And so instead of celebrating that kind of resilient leadership, we punish it because it refuses to surrender to the interest of the establishment of years gone by. It is white supremacy on steroids, and it's coming to an HBCU near you.
Amen. Dr. Malveaux, a couple of minutes for you.
Well, I'm a draftomaniac. I have to learn how to spell that, but a draftomania agrees with me. And I think it ought to agree with most Black people when we look at what's going on. What Brother Uri did is he really does break down the structural ways going back to the history. Our people have been sidelined. And the difference between then and now is that many of us have been awakened and are not going to take it anymore. And so even as, the big question is, what could we do with Tennessee? Well, there are elections coming up. We must vote. But even more than that, these are the kinds of things that potentially could go to even this very biased Supreme Court. Because if you can count, you know the difference between so much per student and so much per student. You know that separate but equal. So I do think that it's very possible for us to talk about a massive movement. And last evening, in fact, Reverend Barber called for HBCU students, the student body presidents, to come together in some undisclosed place with no press to talk about a coordinated campaign. Keep our schools open, and not only open, but also thriving. But the other thing that has to happen, Santita, is that if you didn't go to an HBCU, guess what? Adopt one. Mm-hmm. Find one where you can give money every month or every year. I mean, I think it's really important because we all have a stake in this. PWIs are closing their doors on our young people, and or they find such a hostile space. And I always tell them the value of the HBCU can be seen in me. If I had gone to an HBCU, guess what? I would have been such a nicer person. I would have had to cuss white folks out every other day. I would have. The HBCUs basically taught us to be in the world. PWI, Boston College, taught me how not to be in the world. And I say that all the time. I wish my mom wanted me to go to Fisk, but I didn't want to finish high school. Boston College gave me a full ride and told me I didn't have to finish high school. That was a blessing. Except how many PhDs, high school put us? I didn't drop out. I just left. But in any case, the bottom line point is
it's 5 o'clock.
We see our young people thrive at HBCUs for any number of reasons, and we need to continue at thriving. And the only way we're going to do is to fight for it. And if you did not go to an HBCU, give something to it. Because one day you might be like the person who called, my sister called me, her daughter got put out of an Ivy for smoking pot. Can you make some room for her at Bennett? I said, now, when I first came to Bennett, you asked me why was I going to an HBCU?
Of course.
I got my answer now. Yeah, but we make space when other people can't.
Well, and they see the best in us. As you said, they assume that we are all part of this black pool of genius. And that is true. And they see who you really ought to be. Mm-hmm. And they work like mad until you get there. They are determined not to let our children fail. My father told me when I had to choose from amongst, HBCUs and PWI, Harvard, Yale, Howard, and Spelman, he said, they have the same books, but boy, you're going to get a different kind of education. I hope you go to Howard or Spelman. I hope you do that. And as I've gotten to know and really understand the struggle, I'm so glad that is where I went. But wherever you go to school, the black school is part of you as black people. Take one of these schools on and take on this struggle. Let us support Dr. Glenda Glover. Let us support Dr. Julian Malveaux. Let us support these people who decide to pour everything back into our children to make them who they're supposed to be. I'm Santita Jackson. Stay tuned for the second hour. We got to talk about the killings of these workers who were trying to feed the people of Gaza. What is going on? The IDF, Sheila, bombed them 3 times. You cannot be serious. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show. The proud drapetomaniac, someone who is going to fight slavery, fight being enslaved. Oh, that's right. When you're sick because you want to wander off the plantation, you want to resist massa. That's drapetomania. I'm Santita Jackson. Stay right here. Back for the second hour in just a minute.